Nice promotion, though.
Shadow for now.
Yeah. Morning to you. Thank you very much for joining us. So let's talk specifically about those talks. We understand they are taking place in Doha. We don't know much about them, but is it right, in principle, to be talking to the Taliban?
Yes, absolutely, and we've been urging the government to do this for some time. There's a big difference between diplomatic recognition of the Taliban and a regime that came to force through violence and displaced democratically elected government in Afghanistan, and dialogue. Dialogue is now essential. We're in a new reality. The reality is that because of the series of mistakes that have led us to this point, we are now reliant on the Taliban for permission to move people out of the country. That includes Afghans who helped us, but it also includes British nationals. So that dialogue is absolutely essential and ought to be taking place.
What would you, in that position, be asking from the Taliban? What guarantees?
The key thing now, the urgent priority, is to get thousands of people who either assisted us or are British nationals who are stranded there out of the country. And that means, in reality, despite some efforts to get the airport up and running, that we need safe passage to land borders where people can pass through and have their applications processed on the other side. And that means that we need some guarantees about the Taliban, that people can move freely, that they won't be harassed, beaten, shot at, all things that have happened over the last few weeks when people have tried to move. Anybody who is eligible under a UK scheme ought to be able to move through the country, and that's the guarantee that the government ought to be asking for as a priority.
I suppose that's the peril, isn't it, of international diplomacy, because in order to have those negotiations with the Taliban, they'll want recognising, one of the things they want is recognising as a government and as legitimate. How do you balance that without doing what you said you wouldn't want to do?
Well, this is one of the reasons why we said on the wider issues around, the pressing priority to get people out of the country, but on the wider issues about how you deal with the Taliban, countries have to move together in step. There has to be a united international response, because this is going to be a conditions-based relationship from now on. The Taliban wants recognition, it wants access to international finance, it has huge amounts of assets that are in bank accounts in the West that are currently frozen. So there are reasons why the Taliban would want to engage, and the international community has to agree an approach that means that one country isn't trading away that recognition for a series of concessions against the interests of another. But that creates a new problem for the UK, and this is why it's so appalling that we're in this situation, because you saw it just earlier this week. The government was able to work with other countries in order to get a UN Security Council resolution. But what does that mean? It means we have to do deals with countries like China and Russia, countries that we've tried to take a much tougher approach to in the past. And that is the reality of where the Foreign Secretary has left us, in a position where we're reliant on permission from the Taliban and doing deals with China and Russia just to safeguard essential British interests.
Are you still getting messages from people in Afghanistan who are trying to get out, and what sort of things are people telling you?
It's, if anything, the situation has become even more desperate for those people who were left behind since the air bridge closed. My office is still fielding thousands of cases alongside Labour MPs of people who are still trapped in Afghanistan. We've got British nationals, children who've been separated from parents who are stranded there. We've got people who are in wheelchairs, or somebody who's on dialysis who obviously can't travel to a border, as the Defence Secretary was suggesting. We've also got high-profile public figures, particularly women, who are moving from safe house to safe house, being hunted by the Taliban, and they're running out of places to go because many people in Afghanistan are trying to provide them with shelter, but they're absolutely terrified about reprisals from the Taliban if they shelter people who've helped Britain as well. So yesterday, when I spoke to the Defence Secretary, many MPs were saying to him, there is a real urgency around this. Where is the Foreign Secretary? Why haven't those borders been opened? Why hasn't that diplomatic work been done? And those are the answers we need to hear this afternoon at the Select Committee.
Yeah, and we spoke to Dominic Raab on the programme yesterday, and we spoke to him last week as well, and we put to him some of the criticisms I know that you've mentioned as well. And I think the thing that he kept coming back to was the fact that 15,000 plus people have been got out of Afghanistan in the last few weeks, and he says that is a success. Would you agree with that? Do you think that is that's a successful operation, if you like?
It's been one of the most extraordinary things I've ever witnessed. The soldiers that flew into danger, the diplomats that stayed behind, the border staff, particularly those young people who flew over, have never done anything like this before, making life and death decisions. It's been the most incredible effort. But the weak link in what was a very weak chain that led us to this point was the Foreign Secretary. None of that preparation work was done. Other countries like France were preparing for this months months and months ago and pulling their people out. And he's got to answer the question about why it is that in the end, hundreds of our troops had to be flown into what was an extraordinarily dangerous situation in order to pull people through crowds, to get them out in the most chaotic circumstances. Thousands of people left behind because of 18 months of failure to get ready for this moment.
I mean, the Americans have a large role in that. President Biden has called it as well an extraordinary success.
I mean, President Biden has been absolutely consistent, whether you agree with him or like what he's done or not. He's been absolutely consistent that he was going to end what he called forever wars in his election manifesto and that he was going to pull troops out of Afghanistan. He gave the government 4.5 months of warning about the precise date when that would occur. And yet the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister and the Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office were all on holiday as this unfolded. This is one of the things that Dominic Raab will face at the Select Committee this afternoon. He will be asked, on what intelligence were you relying? If you foresaw that there was a route to victory for the Taliban, why was the Prime Minister telling the House of Commons just weeks ago there was no military route to victory for the Taliban? And why were no plans put in place in order to prepare for that eventuality?
Do you think, and I think Dominic Raab will be asked some pretty tough questions, won't he, at the Select Committee this afternoon. Do you think that the era of ministerial responsibility, of people like Dominic Raab taking the hit for things that have happened on their watch and standing down, do you think that's gone?
I hope not. And that's what the Select Committee members, I think collectively, all of them from all political parties, feel an enormous weight of responsibility. Because in the end, this isn't about blame. It's about people taking responsibility for a situation that has left us weakened in the world, troops sent into danger, thousands of Afghans stranded. The consequences for Britain and many, many people besides are absolutely desperate because the Foreign Secretary was the weakest link in a very weak chain, and he has to take responsibility for that today.
Can I ask you then, I know you're not the Foreign Secretary, but if you had presided over what has happened over the last few weeks, would you resign?
Yeah, I would have done two things. The first is I would have very quickly moved to put plans in place to sort this out. Even yesterday, hundreds of MPs on a Zoom call with the Defence Secretary asking him questions that he simply couldn't answer. He's telling people to go to borders. They can't get through the borders because the diplomatic work hasn't been done to make sure that those borders are open. These are questions for the Foreign Secretary, and yet the Foreign Secretary is nowhere to be seen. But I absolutely would take responsibility for this, and I would expect anybody to take responsibility for this sort of situation. This is the greatest foreign policy disaster of a generation, and the Foreign Secretary has been missing in action. That is just unconscionable given the consequences that we're seeing unfold in Afghanistan.
You've put a series of questions that you want to put to Dominic Raab. We're speaking to Victoria Aitkins here on the programme. We'll put at least as many as we can to her as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
7:20 now, an expensive but game-changing anti-cholesterol drug could soon be offered to hundreds of thousands of people in England and Wales on the NHS.